Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, James Andrews, the Great Locomotive Chase, and the first Medal of Honor. Now let's continue our story about the Great Locomotive Chase. It wasn't long until the William R. Smith reached the vandalized track north of Kingston. Having already circumvented one torn-up rail line, Fuller was keeping a close eye on the situation in front of him as the locomotive barreled down the track at a good clip. Placed just after a blind curve, a pile of railroad ties piled up by the raiders was missed by the conductor, the train's cowcatcher blasting through the pile and sending debris in all directions. The locomotive was unharmed and continued forward, Fuller getting on the engine's running board to get a better vantage point of the railroad in front of him. From there he was able to spot the broken track 6 miles north of Kingston, yelling at the train engineer to stop, the William R. Smith straining to a halt, just a few feet before going off the rails and a potential deadly derailment. While Engineer Harbin got out of the locomotive to assess the damage and even assess if he could fix it, Fuller and Murphy didn't hesitate. They knew other trains were coming from the north, and they intended to meet up with one as quickly as possible, hoping to enlist it in a pursuit of the general. The rain had turned the dirt around the tracks into a quagmire, so they were slowed to a rapid walk, but after about 2 miles on foot, they caught sight of the Texas heading in their direction. Despite the necessity for the engineer to reverse not only the locomotive, but the 21 attached freight cars, the man, named Pete Bracken, did not hesitate, rapidly traversing the remaining 2 miles back to Adairsville, backing the 21 freight cars onto a siding, and before they even stopped moving, was heading north again in pursuit of the general. Fuller positioned himself on the rear part of the tender, now essentially the front of the reverse train. Like the general before him, he asked the engineer to blow the whistle frequently, not sure what might be heading in his direction. Engineer Bracken had warmed to the task, traversing the 9-mile route to Calhoun from Adairsville in just 12 minutes. The Catoosa was still there. This potential impediment to the Texas was avoided, and the backwards-oriented locomotive stopped long enough to get some stronger and more experienced crew. The Texas barely came to a complete stop before it began heading north again, this time with the knowledge that there were no trains headed in their direction. Once the locomotive left, a captain in the Georgia militia, W.J. Whitsitt, essentially ordered the engineer of the Catoosa to also turn around his train, his heavily armed 10-man contingent intent on joining the chase. Texas made up considerable ground on Andrews' raiders, which quickly became evident about 1.5 miles north of Calhoun. The general had come to a stop, Andrews intent on ripping out another section of rail, but only halfway through this process, the group heard a train whistle, and this time looking south, they could see what was obviously a train heading in their direction. Andrews gave the order to get back on the train, the general quickly building up speed and turning a corner, momentarily disappearing from view. For the first time, Fuller was able to see not only the train ahead, but the number of men in Andrews' contingent. More than he expected. He ordered the Texas to a halt shortly before the locomotive reached the spot where the general had last stopped, Fuller needing to determine if the rail was still safe enough to support the Texas. Unfortunately for Andrews and his raiders, the track was still passable. Had they had just a few minutes more, they might have been able to completely rip out a section, effectively ending any further pursuit by train. but the Texas quickly made it past the partially damaged but still usable part of the track. Realizing he had to do something to slow down his pursuers, Andrews ordered that one of the boxcars be uncoupled from the train and left it standing, still on the tracks. He also ordered his men to punch a hole in the rear of the second and now last car pulled by the general, to allow his men to throw railroad ties and other debris directly into the pathway of the pursuing locomotive. The Texas did have to momentarily halt upon approaching the stationary boxcar, but the locomotive's reverse direction was actually an advantage. All Fuller had to do was slowly approach the boxcar. The wagon then coupled itself to the back of the train's tender, and the Texas was soon back to the breakneck speed employed by the engineer, Bracken. However, the ties on the tracks did pose more of a problem. The Texas forced to stop where a crew member would jump out and remove them by hand. In reverse, without a cowcatcher to nudge aside such an obstacle, this was the only more time-consuming solution. Still, once the ties were cleared, the Texas would gain ground on the general, only to fall back when more ties were thrown on the track, this cycle repeating itself continually. Andrews had no choice but to stop at the unmanned refueling location at Tilton, where the general first took on water and as much wood as possible. The tender was rapidly filled to about two-thirds capacity, but then Andrews ordered the men back on the train, the Texas now visible again and bearing down on their position. Once again, his raiders were able to delay the Texas and open up some distance between the two locomotives. Andrews would need all of the cushion he could get as he was next approaching the railroad junction at Dalton, Georgia, where the track split in a Y formation, the right-hand part of the Y branching off north to Knoxville, Tennessee, and the left heading to Chattanooga. This junction had every variety of sidings and switches, and possibly rail traffic obstructing a clear path through the depot. Andrews would have to slow down to determine if the initial switch was directed to the left, traverse a stretch that included a waiting room for passengers, a maintenance building, and railcar turntable used to reverse an engine's direction. Additionally, the exit from the station was on a distinct curve that also called for slow speeds, a necessity that the general could not afford. The engineer halted a few feet from the initial switch, and Andrews got out to inspect it. The raiders were in luck, and the general was able to take the left fork, and with no time for the usual cover story, he merely yelled at surprised station employees that he was on an emergency mission to Corinth and had no time to stop. As the train accelerated by the passenger shed, passengers were surprised by its speed, especially with the locomotive about to take the severe curve out of the station. The engineer, Knight, now on a blind curve, hoped that he was on the right track and not about to hit the dead end of a station siding, but he kept the throttle open as wide as it would go. The soldiers in the rear hurled against what was left of their boxcar, the crew up front holding on to any available grip on the locomotive. Narrowly, the train stayed on the main track without derailing and continued on its way. At this point, the Texas was about 2 miles behind and also quickly reached Dalton, slowing down just long enough to deposit telegraph operator Edward Henderson, who had boarded the train at Adairsville in the event of just such an opportunity. Henderson hurried into the station telegraph office, carrying a hastily written note from Fuller meant for the military leadership at Chattanooga, warning them of the runaway train and potential danger. Anticipating such a maneuver, Andrews halted the general after passing through Dalton and had Scott cut the surrounding telegraph wires. Even after he transmitted the message, Henderson had no idea whether or not it got through. Although it did get through to Chattanooga, unfortunately for the raiders, the telegram would have little to do with their fate. The general reached the long railroad tunnel on what was known appropriately as Tunnel Hill, but was already running low on both water and wood. Some of the soldiers figured, based on the dwindling fuel, that this would be the perfect spot to halt the train in the tunnel and ambush the pursuing locomotive, which, even if heavily manned, could be easily dispatched with the element of surprise. But no such order was given, and the general pressed on. The rails on this part of the line were filled with curves, which slowed down both trains. but the Texas eventually made it to Tunnel Hill, proceeding cautiously, wary of both an ambush or any more ties on the track. But there was no evidence of either the train or any obstacles, Fuller able to clearly see the unobstructed light at the end of the structure. That also told him that the general was running low on wood, as thick black smoke should have still been wafting through the tunnel, but there was no such presence, and the general seemed to be slowing down, another indicator that the locomotive's firebox was not operating at full capacity. Once the Texas cleared the tunnel, Fuller yelled to Bracken to accelerate, confident that catching the Yankees was only a matter of time. Fuller's assessment was correct. The general was completely out of cross ties to throw onto the track, and fuel was so low that eventually Andrews' hat and saddlebags were tossed into the firebox. Oil cans, now completely empty, also went into what was left of the flames, but the speed of the locomotive was clearly diminishing, and the steam gauge was falling visibly. Andrews ordered the last boxcar to be set aflame, intending on possibly burning down one of the smaller wooden railroad trestles up ahead, but in the driving rain the car wouldn't ignite. Andrews, realizing that he needed to anticipate the general's looming inability to continue, then quickly met with a small group of the soldiers and decided that at the appropriate time the raiders were to separate into small groups and attempt to make it back to Federal lines. Although there were 20 men in all, they were only lightly armed with pistols, and a pitched battle would eventually draw an overwhelming response. 2 miles beyond the depot at the small town of Ringgold, Georgia, the inevitable occurred. Faced with a rapidly increasing and lengthy incline, the general slowed, enough to indicate to Andrews that it was time for his final order. Jump off and scatter, every man for himself. By now the Texas was close enough to see the men abandoning the hijacked train, but Engineer Bracken was now only slowly pursuing, wary of an attempt to send the general in reverse, causing a collision. In fact, this is exactly what Engineer Knight attempted to do, but the general had virtually no momentum left, and Bracken merely reversed the Texas, allowing the general to glide back for a few feet and then come to a complete stop. Fuller grabbed one of the 2 ancient shotguns and immediately headed into the woods, intent on rounding up any raiders he encountered. Murphy was more intent on examining the general. He found it surprisingly undamaged after such an intense journey. The Texas was then attached to the runaway locomotive, and the crew began heading in a now forwardly direction, towing the general behind them. The Catoosa eventually arrived on the scene, Captain Whitsitt and his men also descending into the woods to try and smoke out any fugitives, their effort quickly frustrated by one of these soldiers accidentally shooting one of his comrades. The presence of Yankee raiders quickly spread throughout the vicinity. 3 of the 20 men, soaking wet, already exhausted, and not the fleetest of the group, were captured within minutes of abandoning the train. Unfortunately, for the rest of the escapees, they were caught so close to the train that when they fell back on their Florence County, Kentucky alibi, they were practically scoffed at, until they decided that status as a POW might be better than railroad and saboteur spy. That meant that any subsequently captured individuals trying to use the Florence County yarn would immediately be tagged as one of the fugitives. The first 3 unfortunates were subsequently trundled off to the nearest comparably large town of Dalton. 2 other raiders made it to the next morning, but after hiding under some brush for the night, they decided to make their way back to the train track, lost in trying to get their bearings towards Federal lines. They were quickly captured by volunteers, offered up the Florence County alibi, and were quickly dragged to nearby Ringgold and turned over to a Confederate officer. When one of the captives, 18-year-old Private Jacob Parrott, refused to even give his name and regiment identity, he was stripped to the waist and brutally flogged, still refusing to divulge any details of the mission. While the only captive subjected to such abuse, Parrott would bear severe scars from the whipping for the rest of his life. Forced to negotiate deep woods and unfamiliar territory, it was not surprising that every single one of the raiders was captured within a little more than a week. Some came close to escaping, But bad luck or the sheer number of pursuers and residents alarmed by such an audacious enterprise eliminated the anonymity required to make it through to federal lines. Even the two potential raiders, Martin Hawkins and John Porter, were captured, their ruse of enlisting almost getting them out of trouble until news somehow leaked. The two spies had missed the train, and the two new recruits' timing of enlistment and proximity to Marietta ignited suspicion and ultimately confession. James Andrews, in possession of a compass, was able to head due west with two other raiders. More familiar with the territory than the rest of the group, he guided himself and his companions to within 12 miles of Union lines. But a large posse on horseback was roaming in the vicinity of Lookout Mountain, familiar with the remote trails and paths that circumvented the region. Told by local residents of three suspicious unknown individuals who had passed through the area, the group quickly caught up with the fugitive trio. Any attempt by the three to talk their way out of their predicament was fruitless. Andrews even tried to use a Confederate passport issued during his tenure as a smuggler, to no avail. They were arrested and reunited with most of the other captives in the Chattanooga jail and subsequently interrogated in the nearby hotel headquarters of the senior military officer in the region, Brigadier General Danville Ledbetter. Conditions in the jail were hellish, the dwelling formerly a repository for recaptured slaves, meals both horrid and insufficient. News of their plight, or even the attempted raid itself, was unknown to all but General Mitchell. The general had received a promotion based on his seizure of Huntsville and subsequent advance towards Chattanooga, but no attack was forthcoming, and not wishing to diminish his recent success, he did not even mention Andrews or his mission. And Mitchell confided to his son that the men were probably hanged. Undoubtedly, a tribunal of some kind would occur in the very near future. Officially, all of the raiders fit the designation of spy and saboteur behind enemy lines in civilian clothes, stealing and destroying property during a time of war. This did not bode well for the captives, a sentiment that they fully understood. Andrews was the first to be tried in Chattanooga, prosecuted by two Confederate officers before a military court-martial, a proceeding that lasted for much of the rest of the month of April. Although he received defense counsel from prominent attorneys, the proceeding did not go well when he attempted to maintain that he was actually loyal to the Confederacy, an assertion disputed by a former business associate during Andrews' smuggling ventures. At the conclusion of the proceeding, Andrews was informed that he would receive a verdict at some undetermined future date. Throughout the month of May, the prisoners were moved and separated several times, once because of Mitchell's renewed aggression towards Chattanooga, and also because the Confederate hierarchy thought the local attitude toward the raiders was softening, and any death sentences and executions might arouse sympathy and even hostility. On May 31st, 12 of the prisoners were transported to Knoxville. On the same day, the military official in charge of the jail delivered a sealed envelope to James Andrews. Inside was his guilty verdict for both spying and treason, because he had previously professed his loyalty to the Confederacy. His sentence was death by hanging, to be administered on June 7th, a little more than a week away. Incredibly, the other prisoners immediately got to work on a plan to spring their commander from behind bars. That would entail getting him out of the hole, a dungeon-like repository beneath their large cell devised for extra security. This nether region had a trap door with a latch secured by a lock. Their plan also called for an opening to be blasted through the ceiling above their heads, which could be reached if a prisoner stood on the shoulders of other men beneath him. Understanding that any major damage would be observed if it took longer than overnight, the men focused first on the lock and latch, and then on the ceiling above, which they were able to penetrate with a penknife, painstakingly used to saw a hole in the rafters. From there, Andrews and John Woolham were lifted into the eaves between the roof and the ceiling, where they then removed some bricks at one end of their enclosure, allowing them access to the jail's interior courtyard. When they were ready, some blankets and sheets tied together were secured to one of the rafters, allowing them to shimmy down to the ground. Unfortunately, during this process, Andrews accidentally knocked out another brick that tumbled into the yard, alerting nearby sentries who came running and shooting at both men, who actually made it over the secondary fence around the jail. Unfortunately, Andrews, who was holding his boots, lost them in the process and had to scamper barefoot to the banks of the Tennessee River, where he managed to precariously avoid any search parties and hide during the day on Monday. Woolham was more fortunate. He left his coat and vest by the riverside, trying to throw off pursuers who would conclude that he swam to the other side of the river. Then he walked along the riverbank until he found a canoe, headed out at night into the fast-moving current, and disappeared down the Tennessee. Andrews wasn't as lucky. Reaching a bluff that hemmed him in along the riverbank, he took off his pants and swam to the other side, losing his breeches in the fast-moving current and barely making it. Now basically in his underwear and barefoot, he had to walk along the rocky shoreline, stepping on branches and brambles along the way. Exhausted by Tuesday morning, he took the risk of approaching a small boy on the river and asking him to row him to nearby Williams Island. The boy, terrified by the sight of the bearded, emaciated, and disheveled man, agreed, but upon depositing Andrews in the underbrush, immediately went to the nearby riverbank plantation residence of Samuel Williams, the owner of the island. Within a short period of time, Williams discovered Andrews on his property, feet so swollen he could barely move. Samuel Williams did provide Andrews with a solid meal and dry, clean clothes, but he also conveyed him back to the Chattanooga jail. The raiders' ringleader was again tossed back in the hole, this time with his fellow raiders, who were now confined in the depths as punishment for aiding in the escape. And for good measure, he was literally chained to the floor of the dungeon by spikes driven into the foundation. In Knoxville, the other 12 raiders were undergoing court-martials one at a time, the pace swift, but not swift enough to get through all of the defendants before a Union advance threatened Knoxville itself. They were eventually conveyed to Atlanta, and at the last minute all 9 of the Chattanooga raiders were also sent by train back to be reunited with their comrades. Andrews chained at the ankles, forced to endure the ignominy of riding on the same rail line he had recently traversed with the general. After his failed escape, the formerly resolute commander seemed to become completely resigned to his fate, contemplative and quiet. Arriving in Atlanta in the late afternoon of June 7th, the 9 men were conveyed to a nearby barracks. Andrews quickly extracted and placed on a carriage that transported him to a makeshift gallows, but not before he shook the hand of each and every fellow raider on the way out the door. The preparations for Andrews' execution were so rushed that a chaplain was recruited as he walked by the military procession leading to the gallows. This haphazard process turned utterly grisly when Andrews dropped through the makeshift wooden platform, the noose around his neck. It actually stretched to the extent that Andrews' feet were partially touching the ground. Soldiers hastily began digging under them to facilitate at least a slow strangulation, as opposed to the broken neck that caused a much quicker death. The spectacle was so grim that there were shouts of protest, and many onlookers looked away or even left the vicinity. Eventually, Andrews expired and was cut down and placed in a pine coffin, still shackled, and buried only a few yards from the place of his execution. Here he remained until 1887. On June 18th, 7 of the men convicted in the Knoxville trials were separated from the rest of the jailed raiders and conveyed to a separate large jail cell. There, a military marshal formally read them the verdicts from their court-martial and the proscribed punishment, death by hanging. The marshal also informed them that their execution was to occur on that very afternoon. Arms tightly bound, they were conveyed with little more than a yelled goodbye to the other confined raiders to a cart in the proximity of the jailhouse. It only took a few minutes to travel less than a mile to what eventually became known as Oakland Cemetery, the site of this particular execution. The raiders' request to be shot by firing squad was denied, and nooses were quickly placed around the necks of the 7. Given permission to say a few last words, Private George Wilson spoke eloquently, concluding his remarks by stating, "Some of you will live to see the American flag over the spot where we, as soldiers, are about to offer up our lives." A moment later, a Confederate captain gave a signal with his sword, and all 7 men descended through the crude platform. This time all 7 ropes snapped appropriately. Unfortunately, 2 of the men's ropes literally snapped in half. The raiders Campbell and Slavens winding up sitting up on the ground, very much alive. The 2 men were given water, and despite the protests of the crowd, 2 more secure ropes were quickly retrieved and placed around the necks of the 2 men. Forced to observe the still dangling bodies of their comrades next to them on the gallows, despite a common fable that a failed hanging indicates the innocence of the condemned, Campbell and Slavens were soon dispatched, the entire spectacle greatly upsetting to most of the participants, including the soldiers present. One spectator, in a letter to his wife, wrote of the incident, "Is this not awful? Men in the prime of life landed into eternity without an hour's warning, and what for?" Both the manner and brutality of the hangings also made a marked impression on the surviving raiders, understanding that it probably wouldn't be long before they joined their fellow soldiers on the gallows. They were further depressed when escapee John Woolham was delivered to the jail at the end of June. He successfully navigated his way in his canoe beyond Union lines on the Tennessee River, but avoided what he thought were Confederate gunboats that turned out to be Federal vessels. Then, believing that he had to be beyond Union lines, he began rowing during daylight, only to be seized by a Confederate patrol, recognized by an officer who observed him in his original captivity and identified him as a raider. There he was to be subjected to the uncertainty that surrounded the fates of all of the remaining 14 captives, with no official trial and no sentence having taken place, and great confusion as to how the process might even proceed. The prisoners remained in a legal limbo for months. Eventually, the few ranking Union officers even familiar with the raid wrote off the entire group as captured and likely executed. Their captors began to show an unofficial indifference to the group, seemingly lumping them in with the various other prisoners of war, Union sympathizers, and deserters that made up the majority of the jail's political prisoners. That changed in late 1862 with the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, considered a great affront to the entire Confederacy and the type of federal overreach that only underlined the fundamental reasons for the ongoing conflict. Rumors transmitted by other prisoners, and even the black servants who fed them their meals and covertly smuggled in newspapers, indicated that orders to summarily execute the raiders were imminent. By mid-October, a detailed potential escape attempt featuring an attack on the jailer who removed their dinner trays and the acquisition of his keys to extract all of the raiders was put in place. This occurred on the evening of October 16th, all 14 raiders as well as some other prisoners in on the caper, overpowering the only jailer in the vicinity as he opened a cell door to remove said dinner trays. They quickly ran into the courtyard and engaged with the sentries there, the soldiers having stacked their weapons and mostly focused on a card game. By the time the alarm was sounded and the surprise escape attempt was brought to a halt, 10 men successfully climbed over the walls, 8 raiders, a Confederate deserter, and a Union sympathizer from Tennessee. 2 raiders were caught within a short period. The unfortunate deserter detained and then hanged. Familiar with the territory, the Tennessee loyalist made it back to his family in safety relatively easily. Had the other 8 raiders fully understood their situation and the actual logistics confronting them, they might have had second thoughts about even attempting escape. Chiefly as a result of the temerity of Regional Commander Don Carlos Buell, Union forces had retreated as far west as Nashville and as far north as Kentucky, making the Union lines many hundreds of miles away. Buell's performance was so deficient that he was about to be relieved of command, of little solace to the 8 raiders desperately making for Union lines. An entire book could be written about the trials and obstacles overcome by these 8 men, split into small groups, who all spent weeks of literal starvation, danger, and in inclement weather before successfully making it to some outpost of the Union Army. Each scattered in every possible geographic direction, the most remarkable journey by Alf Wilson and Mark Wood, who actually headed south via expropriated small craft, eventually reaching the Gulf of Mexico, and a blockading U.S. warship. Expressing a desire to reunite with their regiment, they were transported back to their unit via Key West, Florida. 6 of the raiders were left behind in the Fulton County Jail. Initially, they feared terrible retribution and even execution as a result of the escape. Strangely, after the initial uproar, they were relocated to a military facility and kept under the more diligent watch of veteran Confederate soldiers. The jail hierarchy seemed angrier with the staff who had allowed the escape as opposed to the escapees themselves. Their food and quarters greatly improved. Their biggest worry, the sheer tedium of not knowing their ultimate fate. That changed abruptly in early December, when they were informed by Confederate officers that they had been officially exchanged for Confederate POWs and were to be transported immediately. Their journey was far from uneventful. They spent a freezing 3-day boxcar ordeal that culminated in their internment in the notorious Castle Thunder prison in Richmond, as hellish as any Confederate detention center. It would be March 17, 1863, before the 6 men were swapped in a massive exchange involving over 300 men. Most were sent to Annapolis, Maryland, for processing, but the 6 raiders convinced the Federals administering the exchange that the 6 were on a special mission and needed to report directly to the War Department in Washington, D.C. Once in the capital, their presence attracted the attention of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who ordered the Chief Judge Advocate of the Army, Joseph Holt, to get to the bottom of what exactly these men were involved with. Sworn testimony was compiled by this jurist, including both spoken and visual evidence presented by Jacob Parrott, the unfortunate captive, who was lashed over 100 times, information that reverberated throughout the government and military. Only days after their arrival, Secretary Stanton, arguably the second most powerful federal official, met personally with the 6 raiders. Known to be ornery and frequently downright dismissive in his dealings with subordinates, Stanton was uncharacteristically jovial, speaking at length with the men and praising their bravery and resourcefulness. To Jacob Parrott, a veritable boy, he offered a full scholarship to West Point. Parrott's response that he had no wish for an education until he was able to vanquish the rebel army so delighted Stanton that he excused himself momentarily and then returned with an astonishing surprise. Asking Parrott to step forward, he explained that Congress had recently authorized an award to acknowledge acts of the highest valor within the U.S. military. Jacob Parrott was to receive the first of these awards, newly named the Medal of Honor. The other 5 men, Elihu Mason, William Pittenger, William Reddick, William Bensinger, and Robert Buffum, were then also presented with the same award. All 6 were given $100, ordered to be compensated for any additional expenses incurred during their captivity and escape, and promoted on the spot. Stanton was further delighted by their sentiment that they immediately be returned to their Ohio regiments and the field of battle. But there was more. Escorted by the military commissioner in charge of prisoner exchanges, the 6 men made the short walk to the nearby White House, where they were quickly ushered into the president's office and a personal meeting with Abraham Lincoln. So comfortable with the chief executive's engaging demeanor and genuine interest in their experiences, the men departed the occasion, truly proud of both their accomplishments and the knowledge of gratitude at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Possibly best of all, they were also granted an immediate 60-day furlough and government-sponsored transportation to their residences. Eventually, news of these honors made its way to the front lines, where the 8 escapees were incredibly already back in military service. Although it took a while, these 8 men also received the Medal of Honor, including the 2 men who had overslept. Over time, all of the men who were hanged also received posthumous acknowledgment, with the exception of William Campbell, who was a civilian, rendering him ineligible. The last 2 Medals of Honor awarded for the Andrews raid were actually presented posthumously to the executed George Wilson and Perry Shadrach on July 3rd, 2024. Today, in Atlanta, only a small marker near the corner of Juniper and 3rd Streets commemorates the spot where James J. Andrews was hanged so terribly for his role in the great locomotive chase. His body was removed from its Atlanta location in October of 1887 and reburied in the Chattanooga National Cemetery. However, he never received the Medal of Honor for his remarkable mission because he also was a civilian. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about James Andrews and the Great Locomotive Chase. Information for this podcast came from the book Stealing the General by Russell Bonds. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.